program initiated and has been coordinating the partnership through grants from NOAA since the first regional marketing campaign on Virginia's Eastern Shore was launched over a decade ago. Plant Virginia Natives now engages and connects hundreds of local, regional, and state partners across the state. I want to call out a few for their role in making tonight's webinar possible. Our Zoom host, Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden, especially Phyllis Laslett and Megan Compton, who also handled registration for our 2,600 plus audience. Our facilitator tonight is Beth Mizell with Blue Ridge Prism. Helping our speaker respond to as many of your questions as is possible tonight will be Nancy Veers, president of the Virginia Native Plant Society, Eva Clark with the James River Garden Club, Mary Lincoln with Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden, Stacy Moles with the Virginia Department of Transportation's Pollinator Habitat Program, and Emily Byers with the Virginia Native Plant Society Jefferson Chapter. I want to also send out thanks to the many Plant Virginia Natives partners who helped plan this event. And finally, thank you to our audience. We would not have this webinar series without you. So there's a little housekeeping we need to keep in mind, and I'm going to turn this overview over to Phyllis.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to pull up a little diagram here that there we go, sorry. This will be a reminder. Many of you have already participated in these programs, and this is just a reminder to you all of some of the housekeeping rules, because there are a lot of you, and we would really, it really helps us to keep things in order and sort out and get as much answered for you as possible. The chat is disabled, so please do not use that option. We are asking everyone to direct your questions to the Q&A box. The way you see that is if you hover over the bottom of your screen, or sometimes with some applications it's the top, you will see the chat, which we're not using, raise hand, which we also are not using because we don't really have a good way with as many people as we have to track you all down. And please use the Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists and speakers. So again, I see a couple of folks have raised your hands. Please type a question into the Q&A box. Just to remind everyone, which I suspect is one of the questions, this program is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording within 24 to 48 hours. Thank you. I'm going to turn this back over to Virginia.
And I'm going to hand the mic back over to Beth Mizell, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Yes, thank you, Virginia, and thank you, Phyllis, for that little Zoom housekeeping. It's nice to turn that over to someone else this evening and get to be the moderator. So again, it's Virginia mentioned, my name is Beth Mizell, and I'm with Blue Ridge Prism. I'm here this evening as a moderator, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Celia Vuocolo, with the Piedmont Environmental Council. Celia, I've worked with Celia for a few years on the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign, and now I get to work with her in my new role at Blue Ridge Prism, and I also consider her a friend and a wonderful colleague. Celia has worked for the Piedmont Environmental Council since 2014 and manages PEC's Sustainable Habitat Program, and is also the co-chair for the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign. She works with landowners interested in managing their property for wildlife habitat, provides outreach and education on wildlife conservation, and also manages PEC's conservation lands. Celia is passionate about native pollinators and is a Master of Science candidate in the Environmental Science and Policy graduate program at George Mason University, where she is researching the occurrence of a parasite in bumblebees. So without further ado, I will turn the mic and the screen over to Celia. And I'd like to remind the audience to send us your questions in the Q&A, and we will be typing answers furiously during the program. And then Celia will have time to answer questions at the very end. So please, Celia, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beth. That was a really nice introduction. I'm really excited to be here this evening to talk about one of my favorite topics of all time, which is pollinator conservation. My goal for this talk is to leave you all feeling really inspired and motivated to help support local pollinator populations in your own backyard. I'm going to provide you with what I like to call a pollinator primer, which is an overview of pollinator biology, give a snapshot of some of Virginia's insect pollinators, followed by an overview of how to provide habitat for them. But first, Beth already really gave you a great overview of my bio, but I wanted to reiterate that, as she mentioned, Beth and I co-chair the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign. And I also want to mention too that I work primarily out of PEC's headquarters office in Warrenton, which is located in Fauquier County, if anyone is familiar. As Beth said, I'm also sometimes a graduate student at George Mason, studying under Dr. Rebecca Forkner on the occurrence of the gut parasite Nosema and its occurrence in bumblebees in our region. My studies are currently on hold as I'm raising two very young daughters who take up most of my free time when I'm not working. So just a little bit about Plant Northern Piedmont Natives. The original Piedmont Natives team formed in Albemarle in 2012 with a vision for promoting Piedmont native plants for use in landscapes and gardens. And the campaign was rebooted in early 2019 when Beth and I came on board. We have a popular Facebook page if anyone wants to check us out, and a native plant guide for our region that came out in 2015. We have over 20 partner groups that support our campaign. The campaign covers 11 counties and the city of Charlottesville in the Piedmont region. Our campaign area consists of both Blue Ridge and Piedmont ecoregions. Lastly, I'd like to briefly introduce you all to the Piedmont Environmental Council, or PEC. I'm sure that some of you may already be familiar with our work, but for those of you who aren't, PEC's mission is broad and multifaceted. We are a 501c3 nonprofit focused on protecting the northern Piedmont of Virginia's natural resources, rural economy, history, and beauty. I like to say that we work to enhance the quality of life for Piedmont residents. PEC works in a 9-county region that includes Loudoun, Clark, Fauquier, Madison, Culpeper, Orange, Greene, Albemarle, and Rappahannock counties. Our role in the region is to engage, educate, and empower residents to become strong environmental advocates. We believe that communities should have an active role in land use decision-making and natural resource protection on the state, local, and county level. I oversee our Sustainable Habitat program, which is focused on the restoration and protection of natural resources. I work with landowners every day that are interested in managing their land, no matter how big their property is, for wildlife. And it's more important now than ever for all of us to do our part in supporting global biodiversity, because we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. 2017 saw the first headline of what the media has dubbed the insect apocalypse. This was due to a German paper that found that in 30 years, 80% of flying insects in German nature preserves had disappeared. The cause was unknown, but researchers hypothesized that heavy development and land use change that happened around the preserves played a major role. This created a wave of concern, with more research gaining media attention, including a 2019 study that found 40% of insect species are declining globally. This is a big problem because our ecosystems rely on food webs that are supported by insects. Insects take part in nutrient cycling, the food cycle, and of course, pollination. The vast majority of plants on Earth rely on animal pollinators to reproduce. We need plants for a variety of important reasons: carbon sequestration, maintaining soil health, clean air, food for ourselves and animals, the list goes on. Native plants are the backbone of healthy ecosystems. And we rely and honestly take advantage of the services that animal pollinators provide to us for food production. Without pollinators, the food system as we know it would change forever. Now, my intention is not to overwhelm you with dread here, but rather emphasize that taking care of pollinators is important because they take care of us. And it's something everyone should understand and embrace. Pollen is a fascinating substance. It contains the genetic material of the mother plant, of course, but it's also made up of fatty lipids, amino acid, and other nutrients that are highly nutritious to a number of animals. Pollen also comes in different shapes and sizes, which can influence a pollinator's ability to collect and consume it. The most efficient pollinators are arguably the ones that actively collect and move pollen to feed its young, ultimately transferring pollen to other flowers kind of accidentally on their foraging journey. Many bee species do this, which is why they are considered to be such valuable pollinators. However, incidental pollinators, which we'll discuss a little bit later, have their role to play as well. Incidental pollinators, or flower visitors, visit flowers to consume nectar and pollen, find mates, hunt for insects, or just like to hang out in the sun. In the process, they may incidentally get pollen on them and then transfer it as they move. But not all plants need animal pollinators. Many plants, including the majority of native grasses and a lot of trees, have pollen that is light enough to be carried by the wind. Other plants have evolved to have heavier pollen that requires an animal to move it within the plant itself or to another plant. There are, generally speaking, two strategies for animal pollinated plants. The first is to invite everyone. I call these party plants. The flowers have certain physical characteristics that make accessing their pollen easy for a variety of different animals. They also may have copious nectar or other attributes that can attract even more animals. The second strategy is to only invite the pollinators that are the most efficient and do the best pollination. I call these invite-only plants. These plants have physical characteristics that actually exclude all but the right pollinators from accessing their pollen. I will say, though, that in the pollinator world, there's always an exception to every rule. And while these two concepts guide how we understand pollination ecology, there's always someone who doesn't follow the rules. Case in point, I took this photo in my backyard. This is a bumblebee exhibiting a behavior called nectar robbing. Here we have an example of a flower. This is the native coral honeysuckle that has developed physical characteristics to attract pollinators like hummingbirds, butterflies, and small bees. Notice the long fluted flowers that prevent a large-bodied bee, like this bumblebee, from crawling inside to access the nectar. Well, bumblebees and other species have figured out a way to simply bypass this and use their mandibles and their tongue to punch a hole in the base of the flower and drink the nectar that way. It's not great for the flower, of course, because it will lose all of its nectar and that it needs to attract the right pollinator, and it doesn't get pollinated in the process. Here's an example of what I call a party plant. This is shortleaf mountain mint. And by the way, if you want a native plant that will eat up lawn, this is it. This landowner planted a bunch of it to do just that and has taken over a massive area, much larger than what's in the picture. Anyway, you can see that it's operating as a virtual landing pad for insects. Any insect can land on its open habit and forage for pollen and nectar. You can't see by this photo, but this patch of mountain mint looked like it was literally moving. That's how many insects were on it. Mountain mint in general is one of the most attractive plants for pollinators. I'm going to talk about it again later on in the presentation because it always ranks high on lists and studies for its ability to track the diversity of insect species. And we have several mountain mint species that are native to Virginia. This is a series of fantastic photos of bottle gentian. This flower never opens up. What you see is what you get. And this is its strategy. Only bumblebees are strong enough to pry open the flowers and shimmy down inside to collect the pollen. Once the flower is pollinated, the tips of the petal turn white, signaling to other bumblebees that the plant has been pollinated. The strategy is twofold. It prevents unnecessary overhandling of the flower and also overexertion of the bee. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the multitude of threats that are facing insect pollinators, but I wanted to take a moment and highlight the 4 main ones. On the slide, you'll see a photograph of the gut parasite Nosema, which is what I've been researching. The tricky thing about Nosema and other viruses, bacteria, and fungi is that they are easily transferred between commercially reared bumblebees and honeybees to native bees. Additionally, pesticides, although they may not have direct lethal effects, like in the case of neonics, they suppress the immune system of bees, making them more susceptible to illness. Climate change also provides challenges for insect pollinators, and I'll highlight this in 2 ways. The first is warming temperatures. So like other animals, bees have thresholds when it comes to temperature changes and tolerance. And we are seeing shifting ranges, most notably in bumblebees as a result. So bumblebee populations are moving northward and higher up in elevations in North America and Europe to escape the heat. Additionally, warming temperatures mean that flowers may bloom earlier or bees may emerge earlier, creating phenology gaps. And I'll get more into this in a little bit. Lastly, the effects of habitat loss are huge. And habitat loss is not always what people think. For a bee or a butterfly, an over-manicured lawn with no flowers is habitat loss. And in the US, we have a lot of that. 50 million acres of lawn to be exact. That and lawns are the 4th largest crop in our country, and we spend a lot of time, money, and resources to keep it up. I know that most of you tuned in for Doug Talamy's kickoff lecture in early March, so I wanted to revisit one of my favorite quotes of his because how we garden does make a difference. We can work to curb the tide of habitat loss and even climate change by decreasing the amount of lawn we own and increasing the amount of native plants we have. And it's amazing to witness the transformation that can occur in your landscape and watch pollinators flourish in your yard. So I thought I would share a story of my own backyard with you to provide a realistic example of how pollinator biology works. It starts with a native coral honeysuckle that grows on the side of my garden shed. For anyone who hasn't seen this species before, it's a beautiful, fast-growing vine, and it does really well on a trellis. Anyway, I noticed a caterpillar on it this past spring, which is the larva of the snowberry clearwing moth. Coral honeysuckle is one of the larval host plants for this species, meaning that this moth's pupa has evolved to feed off the leaves of this plant and just a few others. Hawk moths, A few weeks after I noticed that caterpillar, I went out to view a patch of wild bergamot and found both the adult snowberry clearwing and its close cousin, the hummingbird clearwing, nectaring on the flowers. These 2 species are hawk moths and have some very interesting morphology. They're sometimes confused for actual hummingbirds since their wings beat so fast. Hawk moths have a long proboscis or tongue that is perfectly designed to access nectar from the long corollas of flowers like wild bergamot, bee balm, coral honeysuckle, phlox, etc. This specialized morphology is an important example of the relationship between native plants and pollinators. Taking you back in time a bit, bees split off from wasps when they began to specialize feeding pollen and nectar to their larvae, as opposed to insect prey, which is a wasp behavior trait, which was about 100 million years ago. Bees began to diversify at the same time that flowering plants were, which is shown as the gray funnel on the left side of the chart here. We began seeing fossil specimens of bees with pollen around 140 million years ago, which is shown by that dotted line. There is a direct link between flowering plant evolution and bee evolution, meaning we think they drove the evolution of each other's physical characteristics. There is an ongoing this is an ongoing topic of debate in the world of pollination biology, basically described as, what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's safe to say that there is a connection. We don't know who started it, but evolution occurred. And what this looks like today is a concept called pollinator syndromes. So flowers and bees were figuring each other out over millions of years, And all that work led to mutually beneficial relationships between pollinators and plants. Now, you've seen this earlier in my other slides when I talked about the party versus invite only plants, but this takes that concept a step further by considering flower color and odor and other physical characteristics as well. I've extracted 2 columns from that chart to compare and contrast the differences and strategies that flowers have with attracting the right pollinator for the right job. Look at the column for butterflies. The plants that want to attract butterflies are usually bright red and purple, generally speaking, there's always exceptions, provide visual petal nectar guides, and offer abundant nectar since butterflies do not consume pollen. Contrast that with flies, whose flower preferences have evolved to have brown or dark purple flowers with putrid scents. Think skunk cabbage, for example, which mimic dead tissue and have no nectar, since flies are usually just interested in the pollen. Taking specialization even further, there is a type of bee that exists across all bee families that has the most specialized kind of plant relationship. We call these species pollen specialist bees. These bees only collect pollen from certain plants, some so specific that they may only collect pollen from 1 or 2 species. Their life cycle is timed with the life cycle of the plant, and if their host plant is not present in an area, they will not be either. We have 75 species of specialist bees in the mid-Atlantic, and one of these species, Andrena originae, a native mining bee, shown here in the photo, will be making its appearance soon if it hasn't already. This bee is a forest dweller because it collects pollen from just 2 species of spring beauties, which are delicate woodland ephemeral flowers if you've never seen one before. I guarantee that if you go for a woodland flower walk right now and come upon this plant and there's a bee present, it's probably this little fellow. Here's another example. This is Melissodes lenticulata, which is a specialist on New York ironweed. The bee belongs to the family Apidae, and its sisters are carpenter bees, bumblebees, and honeybees. Bees in this family are characterized as being big-bodied and furry. I like to think of this guy as wearing a pair of fuzzy chaps. But anyway, this bee emerges at about the same time that ironweed flowers in the late summer. So it's interesting because ironweed is a pretty common field plant in the Piedmont, but it's actually quite important because of this intricate relationship it has with the specialist bee. Specialist bees are at some of the highest risk for extinction of all bee species due to the effects of climate change, which can alter the bloom time of plants and habitat destruction. I always recommend that gardeners who are interested in supporting pollinators consider plants that support specialist bees. I have a list of these plants and I can send it out to the group following this meeting if folks are interested. Before I get too far ahead, I'd like to step back a little bit and talk about pollinators more broadly. In North America, our pollinators are primarily insects with the exception of hummingbirds and some bats in the Southwest. I've highlighted bees here on the slide because they're considered to be the workhorses of the pollinator world and are a good place for us to start, I think. But before I go there, I just want to take a minute and get up on my soapbox for some pollinator disclaimers. If you've been stung before, I bet you 20 bucks it was in the late summer or early fall and it was a yellow jacket. Yellow jackets are wasps, not bees, and when they're at the end of their life cycles, have a tendency to just land on you while you're minding your own business and sting you because they've got nothing to lose. They are also colonial ground nesters and aggressively defend their nests if you say, you accidentally run it over with your lawnmower. So this is important because the majority of native bees are solitary, meaning that they are not colonial hive makers and therefore don't have a nest to defend. Also, only female bees have stingers, so your chance of getting stung by a native bee is cut in half just like right off the bat. And carpenter bees are definitely a nuisance and like to chew holes in the side of your house. I get that. But they do pollinate and they're actually excellent orchard pollinators if you can tolerate them. And I'm not going to talk too much about honeybees today because they are non-native and domesticated. And I'm instead going to focus mainly on native insect pollinators. So here's some quick bee facts. So there's about 4,000 or so bee species in North America and 20,000 plus worldwide. We have over 400 bee species that have been recorded in Virginia. In the Piedmont, we have a great diversity of bee species, which includes the rusty patch bumblebee, one of 8 federally endangered bee species in the US. The other 7 are in Hawaii. We have roughly 5 groups or families of bees in the Commonwealth. Apidae consists of large-bodied and harried bees, like I mentioned earlier, which are the bumblebees, honeybees, carpenter bees, et cetera, et cetera. Apidae has both social and eusocial solitary bees. The megachilids are home to leafcutter and mason bees. These are the guys that use nesting tubes and bee houses. They are all solitary bees. Halictidae hosts sweat bees, which is probably the largest of all bee families. And these bees are mainly solitary, but there's a couple of social species in there too. Plaster and mining bees are ground nesting and solitary. I borrowed this photo from Ty Rolston, who is a UVA bee researcher at the Blandy State Arboretum. These are locally collected bee specimens of his, and I think this photo really showcases the diversity of body size, shape, and color in our bee community. If you look closely, you'll see the metallic green sweat bees on the left, the long antenna of the longhorn bee, and the black and yellow furry bands of the big common eastern bumblebee queen. Through the growing season, which in Virginia is roughly April to November, these bees are emerging, overwintering, laying eggs, dying off, and there are some bees in this photo whose life cycles will never overlap with the other. For instance, here's an example of the Andrena genera, who are primarily spring mining bees. You can see here that their peak local populations occur in April, and they are dormant by June. Contrast that with Agapostemon, which are sweat bees, and you'll see a very different life cycle, one that starts in June and then peaks in October. The mining bees are out and about right now. As I mentioned, they are the most abundant in the spring and forage on spring ephemerals, orchard crops, and native trees and shrubs. Many Andrena species are also pollen specialists. Mining bees are solitary, as I mentioned, and lay single eggs that are provisioned into cells with pollen balls that will sustain the newly hatched larva. Each of the holes in this photo here represent one queen's egg cells. Once the queen finishes laying her eggs, she leaves and looks for the next nesting opportunity. The eggs will hatch out on their own. So here's a diagram of what this looks like, roughly speaking. We are most familiar with the nesting behavior of honeybees, which are actually in the minority when it comes to a typical bee reproduction. The vast majority of North American native bees are solitary, with the exception of some sweat bees and bumblebees. So bumblebees are technically primitively eusocial, which means that they create a nest or a colony in the ground that's inhabited by female worker bees, queens, and males, but the colony is seasonal, whereas with the honeybees, those are permanent, enduring colonies. The only bumblebee individual to survive the winter is the new queen. Additionally, the bumblebee colonies usually contain only about 50 to 200 individuals, compared with honeybee hives, which usually have 20 to 30,000 individuals. Megachilids, or mason bees and leafcutters, are also solitary. They use mud or leaves, depending on which species you're talking about, to provision the cell walls in between their eggs inside of hollow tube-like structures. What's neat about these guys, I think, is that their pollen collecting hairs are actually on the underside of their body. You can see I have a little red arrow there on the right side of the screen. Most of you are likely familiar with Osmia lignaria, or the blue orchard mason bee, which is part of this family. And the blue orchard mason bee, of course, is well known because of its use in commercial crop production. I took these photos in the front landscaping of my house. These cuts were made from leafcutter bees. So they use their really strong mandibles to chew almost these perfectly concentric circular pieces of leaves to use in their cavity nesting. What this looks like is what we have illustrated here. My friend Samantha Gallagher, who is an artist and entomologist, created this image of a mason bee nesting. So mason bees carry mud instead of leaves, hence the name, to wall off each individual egg cell. I have a couple of examples here of leafcutter and mason bee houses because I wanted to spend some time showing you all what constitutes a safe and healthy bee house, because neither of these three houses got it quite right. The photo on the left is a bee house that was given to me, and I put it in our pollinator garden at the PEC office. What I like is that the roof provides a bit of an overhang, but it's still not enough. What I would want to see are a roof that provides more of an overhang that protects the tubes from the elements. Some of the bamboo tubes as well that are in this house are the right diameter, but others are too large. If they're too large, which tends to be the case with a lot of these commercial houses, native bees won't use them, and instead you'll get spiders and wasps moving in. Also, butterflies will not use those slot things that are up on the top of this nest box, so those are really not needed. Lastly, it's important that the wood is not treated with chemicals or painted. The structure in the middle is super cool and is actually located in the pollinator garden at the Blandy State Arboretum. The hole sizes are correct, and it's made from a cedar tree trunk, which is really neat. But the problem with this one is that it's almost impossible to clean out those drilled holes if they've been used for nesting before. And if they've been used, a bee will not go back in and reuse it unless it's cleaned. Lastly, this is probably the worst bee house I've ever seen, and I have it hanging on my office wall for that reason. Tubes are way too big. There's no roof to protect it. It's made of some really super flimsy material, and it would probably just blow away in a windstorm. So what I want you to think about is, keep a small amount of tubes or holes if you're going to try this for mason bees, so that you're not encouraging large congregations of insects that can spread disease to each other. And you want to be able to replace the materials yearly. And you'll want to put the bee house in a protected area, but it needs to have some sun. Lastly, make sure that the materials are all natural. So what we consider to be the honeybee is known as Apis mellifera, or the Western honeybee, but honeybees broadly include several other highly social Apis species and subspecies. Most honeybee colonies are managed, but feral hives do exist, with feral populations subsisting in the wild for decades sometimes. However, if you see a honeybee on a flower in your garden, it's more than likely came from your neighbor's hive, as honeybees can travel up to 6 miles to forage. Honeybees are generalists when it comes to flower foraging, but they do show preferences. So they are highly efficient pollinators of orchards and crops, we know this, and their hives are easily moved around, hence why our agricultural system relies so heavily on them. And in these heavily managed ag landscapes, clean farming has really just done away with all the shrubby and wild areas that along crop fields that normally host and support native pollinator nesting sites and habitat. Colony collapse disorder, which is basically a perfect storm of pathogens, pesticides, and other threats, have greatly impacted the honeybee industry. However, because this species is domesticated, it does remain globally secure. Bumblebees are close cousins of the honeybee and are found on almost every continent, and one of my favorite species, if you couldn't tell. They are large-bodied and prefer temperate climates. Bumblebees have been shown to be more efficient pollinators than honeybees on a variety of orchard and vegetable crops. They exhibit a behavior called buzz pollination, which not a lot of other bee species do. And basically they clasp the anthers of the flower and vibrate their body until the pollen shakes loose. Many plants, including some crops like tomatoes, require buzz pollination in order to reproduce. I love this photo on the left because it's just one of my favorite bumblebee species, one, which is the perplexing or the confusing bumblebee, but because it also shows just how hairy they are. The hair helps them withstand cooler temperatures, but it also greatly enhances their pollinating power. Bumblebees are considered generalists, but they do have flower preferences, and what they prefer greatly depends on each species' tongue length. Yes, bumblebees have different lengths of tongue, which allows them to access nectar from different shapes of flowers. In Virginia, we have about 11 species of bumblebees. On Easter Day, I saw my first bumblebee queens. They were Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted bumblebee. I'd say that it's probably about a week early. Usually we see bumblebee queens coming out a little bit later into April. Nevertheless, in the Piedmont, these are usually the first species, followed by the brown-belted bumblebee and the common eastern bumblebee. And this last one, the common eastern, has the longest life cycle in our area. It emerges in the spring, and I usually see it well into October. 3 of the bumblebees on this list, the American bumblebee, yellow bumblebee, and the black and gold bumblebee, have been experiencing precipitous declines over the past few decades. I wouldn't be surprised to see one or all make it onto the endangered species list in the next 5 years. Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, was listed under the ESA about 4 years ago. This bumblebee has been lost from almost 90% of its range over the last 20 years, which has caused her serious concern. 4 citizen scientists from the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute encountered one at Sky Meadow State Park in Fauquier County in 2015. It was thought completely extirpated from the mid-Atlantic. Since the specimen was collected, Virginia Natural Heritage Program biologists have recorded the rusty patch in Augusta, Bath, Highland, and Rockingham counties, which is really exciting, but also put them directly in the path of the now defunct Atlantic Coast Pipeline Project. This past fall, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned U.S. Fish and Wildlife's permits that it issued to Dominion and Duke Energy, citing that the agency had been incorrect in finding that the pipeline wouldn't negatively affect the bumblebee and 3 other TNE species. If you're interested in learning more about the rusty patch in Virginia, check out the Department of Wildlife Resources new page. I, along with Ty Rolston and others from across the state, were collaborators on this website. It's a really great source of information. So here's our carpenter bee friend. As I mentioned earlier, it's a close relative of honeybees and bumblebees. Very large bee, probably our largest in the area, and it has similar colors to bumblebees, so often confused for the other. One way to tell them apart, if you can get close enough, is that carpenter bees have a completely hairless abdomen. It actually reflects light. It's so shiny, so sometimes you can see a glint like it's shown in the upper right photo there. And bumblebees are completely hairy. So it's kind of, for me, it's easy to tell them apart. And lastly, I decided to highlight the green sweat bees for the halictids because I think they are just so darn cool looking. These guys are really common throughout the summer and inhabit a variety of habitats. You might remember that this is the largest bee family, and we have about 9 species of metallic green sweat bees in our area. So in Virginia, we are lucky to have a diverse array of non-bee pollinators. Most are understudied, so not a lot of information exists on pollination rates and preferences. However, there is a growing consensus in the pollinator conservation community that non-bee insect pollinators play an important role in plant production. So bees belong to the insect order Hymenoptera, so I thought I would mention a few other bugs in that group as well. There are over 50,000 species of non-bee pollinators in this order worldwide. These 3 insect groups make up the majority of these 50,000 species, so ants, wasps, and sawflies. Pollination by ants is rare and pretty understudied. Wasps are mainly carnivorous, but there are some pollen foragers as well. Sawflies, which are not true flies, are really weird and unusual pollinators. The adults consume pollen and nectar, but their larvae, which is shown here in the photo, actually consume leaves. And some species of sawfly larvae are considered agricultural pests when they are in large quantities. The larvae tend to congregate in groups, which is a strategy to protect themselves against predators, and they'll stretch out to make themselves look bigger, like they're doing in this photo, when they feel threatened. Orchid pollination is fascinating and deserves its own lecture for sure, but I wanted to highlight this pollination relationship because I just think it's super neat. The flowers of the spider orchid, which can be found in Australia and South Africa, emit a chemical odor that mimics the pheromones of the female spider hunting wasps. Naturally, the male wasps fly over to investigate and pollination happens. It has been observed, however, that the male wasps will figure out the ploy after 1 or 2 times. So this usually only works on like newly emerged males. So globally, Lepidoptera contains over 141,000 species of butterflies, moths, and skippers. Butterflies do not actively collect pollen, so if they are visiting a flower, it's usually just to consume nectar. Nectar doesn't have a purpose for the flower other than to attract animal pollinators. So Lepidoptera are considered incidental pollinators for this reason, but they can carry pollen over greater distances than some other insects, and they can be highly effective pollinators in certain situations. Here is an example of a highly specialized butterfly-plant pollination relationship. Research has revealed that although flame azaleas, which are native to the Blue Ridge, attract several types of pollinators, they rely almost entirely on large butterflies, like the great spangled fritillary butterfly, which is shown here, or the eastern tiger swallowtail, to reproduce. The male and female parts of the flower, which are the stigma and the anther, are too far apart to easily exchange genetic material. So as the butterfly lands to acquire nectar, the pollen collects on their large wings and is transferred to other parts of the flower. So there's actually a surprising amount of flies that act as pollinators. About 1/3 of all fly families host pollinating species, which is pretty significant. Adult flies can consume nectar and pollen, depending on what the species is, but many species visit flowers for other reasons and transfer pollen during these activities kind of accidentally. Predatory species or larvae hunt for aphids and other small insects on flowers, and various species of butterflies and bee flies just like to hang out and sun themselves on petals because they feel like it. So hoverflies are probably the most common type of fly we have in our neck of the woods, but there are 6,000 species within the family Syrphidae, and we have a multitude of species in Virginia. Hoverfly larvae are beneficial insects, while the adults consume pollen and nectar. Hoverflies are known as bee mimics because their coloring and patterns mimic the look of bees, which of course helps them ward off predators. And finally, we have the beetles. Not the Abbey Road kind, but instead we have over 70,000 species of beetles that are considered flower visitors. Beetles can be rather destructive house guests, meaning that they consume pollen, nectar, and plant parts when they forage, but they do pollinate and are probably some of our oldest pollinators. They're pretty understudied though, so it's not much is known about their pollination efficacy. Whew, okay, did we cover everything? Not quite. So in other parts of the world, birds and mammals like lemurs and bats and even more insects play a role in pollination. Case in point, this is just some really fun research that came out a few years ago that found 41 species of grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids from Southeast Asia appear to be pollinators. What's interesting is that some species can be distracted by attractive flowers, which could deter them from crop damage, theoretically. Just know that we're still striving to understand how non-target pollinator species contribute to native plant and crop pollination. It's estimated that non-bee species could be responsible for up to 1/3 of crop pollination, which is pretty significant. So now that we've touched on the natural history of pollinators, I'd like to offer some advice on how to create habitat for them. Always remember that habitat really has just 4 components: food, water, space, and cover. Tweaking each of these building blocks for the species or species groups that you are managing for is the key to habitat management, whether it's for pollinators, deer, or grassland birds. What I would really like to emphasize in this section is that pollinators use all parts of the landscape, depending on their needs and what the time of year it is. I think this is an under-promoted concept in pollinator conservation. We tend to think about our sunny fields and flower gardens, which are very important, but pollinators need forests, riparian zones, and transitional areas to make a living too. This is a great aerial photo of some Orange County farm country. And when I look at this photo through the eyes of a pollinator, I just see a lot of opportunity. I see open areas for foraging in the summer, but also forested islands that provide nesting opportunities and floral resources in the spring. Depending on the bee species, an individual may only forage in the 200 square foot radius its entire life, or it may fly for miles. Either way, that bee needs access to the right habitat, which is why I want you to look at your whole property when you consider managing for pollinators. Consider the wild places and the manicured gardens and observe where the bees go. These are my 3 recommendations for landowners that are looking for a starting place. It's important to first look at your property as a whole and consider all the different microclimates, plant communities, and impervious surfaces. So this would be your lawn and blacktop. Then take a look beyond your property's borders. What does it connect to? Is it parkland? Are there 3 other suburban lots? Is it a farm field? Whatever. Then lastly, break your property up into sections that reflect similar geology, water and light conditions in order to get started with plant selections and management activities. When thinking about how your property connects to larger landscape, consider this: wildlife don't see property lines. And this is important to think about no matter what the species is. You'll want to consider how your property can lend itself to habitat connectivity across a larger landscape. These are my 6 tips for creating pollinator habitat. And the big takeaway here is to plant Virginian natives and to be a messy gardener. At the very least, try to plant a suite of native flowers that bloom from early spring to fall so that pollinators have something to eat all season long. You'll want to pay special attention to the natives that support specialist bees too. I thought this was a good example of a selection of plants that bloom from March to October. Now, some of these plants are not native to Virginia, so don't take this verbatim. This is a Mid-Atlantic species list from the Xerces Society, but wow, 11 plants and the whole growing season is covered. This is really what I would like you guys to shoot for. When it comes to cultivars, my advice to you is to avoid them if you can. We know that some cultivars of native species that are in the nursery trade do not provide the same habitat or forage quality that the street species do. If the plant's leaves or petals are a different color or the flower is a different shape, it's not to be trusted. Native wildlife may not recognize these flowers and might not use them as a result. So you don't want all of your hard work to be for naught. So just stick with straight species. Also, if you're gardening for wildlife, be aware of plants that are treated with pesticides. This kind of goes without saying, but it's best to purchase plants from trusted local native plant nurseries who are transparent about their growing processes. Selecting plants that have a diversity of flower, shape, and color is really key as well. This will ensure that you will attract a diversity of pollinators, and it's really quite that simple. If you plant it, they will come. Here's a close-up of that same pollinator plot, which is on a private property in Rappahannock County. You can see that this landowner selected plants for a variety of color, shape, and height. This plot attracts a large and diverse number of pollinator species and is aesthetically very pleasing. My recommendation for trees and shrubs is to always add at least 1 to your pollinator habitat project. I know sometimes that's tough if you don't have a lot of space, but you really want to have that feature somewhere. There are Virginia native shrubs and trees that work for smaller spaces like New Jersey tea, which is pictured here. Just have to do a little research. And don't underestimate the value of existing trees like the ubiquitous red maple. This guy is going to town right now, and it is such a great but underestimated tree for pollinators. Mason bees, mining bees, bumblebees, honeybees, everybody are, just all foraging on red maples right now. It goes to show that you don't always need to have a super showy shrub or tree to support pollinators. Cover can come in a couple different forms, and I think I've already mentioned this a little bit today, but There really isn't a surefire way to encourage ground nesting bees. I've gotten this question a lot. So if you figured this out, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. Best I can offer is that they will select their own sites for nesting. And if you discover it, do your best to protect this area from kids and dogs. In agricultural areas, hedgerows and shrubby fence lines are beacons for pollinators. They often contain both high plant species diversity and nesting site opportunities. This doesn't look like much to us, but for a pollinator, it's a little oasis. Protect these areas if you have them and manage for invasive plants. That's really important. So I lived in a townhouse in Prince William County for a couple of years, so I got real thrifty about what plants I added in because I had such a small amount of space. And I know there's a lot of folks out there too that don't have a lot of opportunity on their properties, but just know that a little bit goes a long way. If you don't have a lot of space, you might want to get the most bang for your buck and select one of my party plants. Some other examples of these other than mountain mint are goldenrods and asters, just to start. But just note that these guys, you know, they're field plants and are very strong shouldered, so they'll move around and make themselves comfortable. So you don't have room for much else, but you know, maybe that's okay. And of course, try to pick at least one plant for a seed per each season. All right, so I thought I would end the presentation with a series of slides on some great natives that support pollinators. I want to emphasize though, these are Piedmont native plants. So if you live on, say, the coastal plain, they might not work in your area or be native there. So, and it's very important when selecting natives that you pick the right plant for the right condition. So let's start with the redbud, since it is actively blooming along our roadsides right now. So redbud hosts 19 species of caterpillars. It's a really important nectar source for newly emerged bumblebee queens. And it's just a really fantastic flowering tree that's a great substitute for non-native cherry tree or Chinese dogwood. This is winterberry, which I like to call an all seasons plant. It's got kind of these small nondescript white flowers that bloom in the summer, but they offer a ton of nectar and pollen and attract all sorts of pollinating insects, including honeybees for miles. Winterberry also produces berries that persist through the winter, hence the name, and it's an important food source for birds in the colder months. It also has great habitat structure and is aesthetically very striking in the winter. This is one example of a native viburnum. There are other ones that you can plant as well. Viburnum offers forage for spring pollinators, fruit in the late summer and fall for birds, and also hosts 104 species of caterpillars. This species in particular, southern arrowwood, likes average to wet soils, kind of part to full sun. Doug Talamy always says, if you can plant one thing, make it an oak. He says this because oaks host the largest amount of caterpillar species in North America, which is 557 caterpillars. That's just crazy to me. But oaks are also a cornerstone of our forests and provide habitat and acorns for mammals. But not everyone has the space for an oak. But if you do, I'd suggest planting it. So going from a really big plant to kind of diminutive, here we have field pussy toes. This is a neat little plant because it can be used as a ground cover in tough spots. Puts up tiny little white flowers that look like cat's toes in the springtime. I took this photo last April at the cemetery at Mount Zion Historic Park in Loudoun County. It does best in dry soil, kind of full or part sun, and hosts the fabulous American painted lady butterfly. So mountain mints, I think I've said this a lot already, but they are true pollinator powerhouses. They aren't true mints, but they can be thugs in the landscape. So they need some space and they spread by rhizomes. So the ones that are native to the Piedmont are mainly sun-loving, but Pygnanthemum incanum or hoary mountain mint can handle some shade. The one pictured here is narrowleaf mountain mint, Pygnanthemum tenuifolium. Monarda is a keystone plant for bumblebees, highly recommended for any butterfly or bee garden. Also hosts 3 specialist bees. It is like mountain mint though, in that it needs space and it will expand by runners. And then we have our native asters, which are some of my favorites. They are the host plant for 6 specialist bees and support caterpillars of 112 species of moths and butterflies. They are important members of several endemic plant communities and are highly attractive to butterflies and bumblebees. I like to say there's a native aster for every situation, whether it's shade, sun, wet, dry, and they bloom during the fall when a lot of other flowering species are scarce. As a matter of fact, this photo of aromatic asters on the front steps of my old townhouse in Prince William County on Halloween. Coreopsis is easily found in most garden centers. Just make sure it's the street species. I like this one because it attracts tiny sweat bees and hoverflies, and it also blooms for a very long time, which is a nice attribute. Liatris also ranks really high for its attractiveness to butterflies in particular, and should always be in addition to any butterfly garden. It is a field plant, so it's sun-loving and likes average to dry soils. It can flop over, so put it next to some strong-shouldered plants. Last but not least, it is bluebell season. So bluebells are actually well suited in the garden, even if they are just kind of considered a floodplain plant. They are another one that's really important forage for queen bumblebees early in the spring. So I want to leave you all with some additional resources so that you can continue learning about pollinators. Most of the ones I'm going to mention are books, but I'm going to start off with one website. So the Xerces Society website is the starting place for all things pollinator, in my opinion. There's so much great info on there, and a lot of it is regionally specific, which is really nice. You'll find additional website links on their site, more books, and a ton of fact sheets. I think these 3 books will cover most of what you'll ever need to know about supporting butterflies. If you haven't read Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, go order a copy right now. I also really love the Xerces Society Gardening for Butterflies book, and Bob Blackney's Butterfly ID book is really informative. I think Attracting Native Pollinators is my go-to pollinator book. If you want to just get one book to start with, I would say that's probably the one, as it covers a lot of different insect groups and topics. I'm still reading Pollinators and Pollination. That one just came out last Christmas, and Heather Holm, who wrote the last one here on the right, has a bunch of books. So I would say just check out her website. She actually just published a book that's just on wasps, which looks really cool. And if there's anything else left that needs to be covered on bees, here it is. The Bumblebee book is really nice and succinct, and you can use it for identification. Bees in your backyard will walk you through a ton of different bee species, and their life history is just really great stuff. All right, well, this closes out my presentation for this evening. Thanks so much for joining me. I believe I'm now going to turn it over to Nancy Veers, president of the Virginia Native Plant Society, who is going to facilitate the Q&A. So.
Well, thank you, Celia. That was a lot of information. I'm sitting out here in the bluebells with my cat, Henry David.
Oh, my favorite cat. I love him.
Yes, just for you, Celia. We've had a lot of good questions, and let me get to them. Our co-moderators have put them into a lot of different categories, and so I will start. There are a lot of questions here, Celia. We'll see how many you can get to.
Okay.
Under bees, are carpenter bees good guys? Can they safely be dissuaded from drilling into wood on my house?
Yeah, that's a carpenter bees. So they are definitely good guys. And, you know, I didn't get too into it. But, you know, I think I did mention they're really great, like orchard pollinators, and you know, they pollinate a number of native plants. I've seen them before many times on like the native passion flower vines and things like that. So they definitely, you know, have their place. It's just that they've become a little bit of a nuisance problem for most of us. I'm not familiar with anything that's non-lethal that actually works. You know, I've heard a lot of different things over the years, anything from make sure you keep, you know, the outer parts of your house painted and stained, that they like a little bit more natural wood. And, you know, if it's not naturalized or it's treated, then maybe they'll be less likely to do it. But I've seen them just like chew right through the side of paint. So it's really hard to say for sure. I'll see if I can maybe find some more information, and, you know, maybe with a follow-up email, I can offer some suggestions, but I have yet to find anything that really works 100% of the time.
Well, I have to say that as a birder, if you like pileated woodpeckers, you have to have carpenter bees. Or,
Yeah.
well, excuse me, carpenter ants, not carpenter bees. Never mind. But
I
the
mean, they
carpenter
probably eat carpenter
bees.
bees too. Well, what can happen sometimes is on the side of people's houses, what they won't realize there's carpenter bees, and they'll hear a woodpecker like, drilling on the, and it's because they're going for the carpenter bees. So
Yeah.
that does happen.
Because you have a problem.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, here's one that's sort of an issue for a lot of people kind of wondering about. Do honeybees outcompete our native pollinators? Are they a problem for our native bees?
It's tricky because the research shows both scenarios, depending on what the actual research has done, so we have, that's where the issue lies, is we have conflicting information. We have some researchers that say, "No, I've never found any issue with competition with native bees," and other ones have said, "Well, yes, I have." I think it's safe to assume that there is competition occurring. How much it affects native bees, I'm not quite sure. I think that's the other question too, is does it affect native bees so much that it becomes a problem for them to sustain their populations? The issue arises when you have a lot of honeybee hives concentrated in one area, which I've heard of and I've seen, out and about. And that's when it does become a problem, because you just have thousands and thousands of honeybees just concentrated in one area, and you're going to see some effects that way. The other issue too with honeybees is that, they will, put other diseases out there into the environment. Bumblebees are susceptible to a lot of honeybee diseases, and there's some other native bees as well. So that is another secondary problem. So I hesitantly say, yeah, probably, but we need more research, I guess.
Yeah, I think Heather Holm had said about the same thing too.
Yeah.
Do you have any resources that you can recommend for identifying the bees coming to our plants?
Yeah, so it depends on what they are, but those last two bee books I showed, the Bumblebee book is a really great one that helps you kind of learn the color patterns of bumblebees, because that's really the best way to identify them on the wing, is just learn how the yellow and black, kind of works on the bodies. Bees in your backyard does have a lot of information as well about individual bee species in groups. Keep in mind though that, and I get a lot of questions about this, some bees you're not able to identify two species unless you actually physically have the specimen in like a microscope and like a, taxonomic ID. So there's some that are really tricky, and others like bumblebees that you can sort of figure it out. If you can at least want to know, generally speaking, like what family it is or what genus, then you could probably use one of those books.
Yeah. Did you mention a solitary bee species as being eusocial? How is that possible?
I did not. I probably just talked over myself. So eusocial, that is probably the bumblebees. Yeah. So I think on that one slide, there was a couple of families I was going through, but bumblebees are only like primitively eusocial bee species, other than like, the honeybees, of course, are social bees. But yeah, they're the only other ones really.
Okay. Do you know what's going on right now with my bee house was busy in the fall. It's busier now. Are eggs being fertilized? What's going on?
It really depends. So, because right now what we're seeing are, I mentioned like a lot of the mining bees, which are early bees, some of our well, in the case of a bee house, it would be probably mining bees that are coming out. So there's a good chance they're hatching out, or depending on the species, some of the females may have underwintered under the ground and now they're foraging around and they're laying eggs in the house. So there's any number of things going on depending on what the species is.
Okay. Is there any research on the impact of Asian jumping worms on ground-dwelling bees? This person was thinking about the changes to the soil profile that's caused by the worms.
That is really interesting. And I on it, just personally have been more interested in learning about those jumping worms because I know that they are incredibly impactful to the soil health and just the biotic community. So I don't know if anybody's really done any research on that, but that would be interesting to look up.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
know. I can't say for sure if they would have an effect. I feel like they probably there have to be like a really heavy population of them in an area to affect them maybe.
Yeah. The next few questions are about bee houses, so I'm going to sort of ask them together.
Yeah.
How do you clean out the bee houses? What's the right diameter for bee house tubes? Can you use paper straws for cavity nesting tubes? And do you have any recommendations for cavity nesting bee houses?
Yeah. And I thought too that I'm like, I should probably look up what the exact diameter is for bees. I don't know off the top of my head. I forget what the diameter is, but a lot of times what you can do, and this is what I've done in the past, is I've gone, just to someplace like Amazon and, check to make sure I have the right diameter, and just ordered a bunch of, they're just like little cardboard tubes. And what I'll do is you can get like 100 of them for $20, and I'll take like a cluster and I'll just bind them, and then I'll put them like in a tree, or a shrub crook of like some branches, and I'll get really good activity that way. And it sort of also, makes it so you don't have, those insect houses where there's just like hundreds of tubes. You want to try and avoid that. So anything that's small, where maybe you only have like 20 or so tubes, is really kind of the way to go, because the more bees you have kind of congregating together, the more likely you're going to get disease and things. And there are actually non-native invasive leafcutter bees and mason bees and things like that can also take up residence in some of those and now compete our native ones, which is, a whole nother issue. Yeah. And then, for cleaning them out, it's kind of the same thing. You just wait. You can tell when somebody's in there because the end is sealed off with either mud or leaf matter or something. And when everybody's hatched out, then that's when you want to just pull all those out, those cardboard tubes or bamboo tubes. And I like to compost mine in my compost, but and then you just replace them. So yeah, that'd probably be around this time, but you just want to make sure nobody's still in there before you replace them. And it's really hard to, if you drill holes into the wood and do that. I've experimented with that. It's really tough. I mean, you can take some like pipe cleaner and try and shove it in there, but those are hard. So you just maybe have to make new ones.
Yeah, I guess they seem like the most natural ones, though.
They do. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I should say too, I mentioned the Xerces Society. I mean, the Xerces Society has a whole slew of information and handout about bee houses and things that people can look online for.
Yeah. Let's see, did we answer everything there? How far into a tube do the bees lay their eggs?
Not far, which is why you don't want them to be super long. I mean, it really, what is that, maybe 3-4 inches? I mean, they don't really, even the ones that a lot of times that you find for sale are longer than they need to be. But it's not too big of a deal. You just want to make sure that if it is a tube that you're purchasing and you're putting it into a house or you're letting it freestanding, you want to make sure it has some sort of back. It can't be a tube that's, open all the way to the end because they won't use it.
Okay. Somebody has asked about ground nesting bees. I think you've answered this, but do they sting?
They can. It depends what kind of ground nesting bees we're talking about yellow jackets or not.
But they're not bees, right?
Yes, exactly. Not bees. Yeah. I mean, I think it depends. I mean, sure. Like a ground nesting native bee, sure, it can sting, but the native bees that are ground nesting, unless they're bumblebees, are going to be the solitary ones. It's going to be the queens that are kind of minding their own business, laying eggs and then leaving. They really don't have a motivation to sting you, unless, gosh, I don't even know, like what you'd probably have to like accidentally like, trap one in your arm or in your clothes for it to sting you. Because unlike yellow jackets or other honeybees or bumblebees that want to defend a hive, you're really not going to have them kind of being the aggressors in the situation. They much rather just fly away. So.
Okay. Here's one. How do I plant and ensure that I do not destroy ground nesting bees in my planting and restorations. I want to help them not destroy their habitat.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, the best thing to do is, and I think I mentioned it a few times, is to, observe where the bees go. And I mean, bees will nest in different areas every year. So the ground nesting bees. It's interesting about like leaf cutters and mason bees with those bee houses. They actually exhibit like nest site fidelity. So you'll have multiple generations coming back to the same house, which is kind of cool. Ground nesting bees don't do that though. They will move around in the landscape. So, you'll be able to tell if you're gonna go dig up an area, and you'll see, in that one photo I have, all the little holes, and they tend to go in, for areas that are sandy, bare ground, when there's not a lot of other vegetation. So, unless you're seeing evidence of ground nesting bees, I don't think it'll be an issue. And they'd probably be more happier that you're putting plants in the ground for them than not. So.
Okay, I think that last question we have in the bee category is, can you recommend something, I guess, plants that attract bumblebees, but not sweat bees, flies, wasps, or hornets?
I cannot guarantee that. I can't.
That's a hard one. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, they'll all show up. It's really hard to know, because while there are those, the pollinator relationships and the syndromes and things like that, there's that one picture of like I had of the bumblebee that's nectar robbing from that coral honeysuckle plant. Like, they'll all figure out a way to hang out anyway, and you're better off not excluding bees, anyway, because you do want a diversity of different species and stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna say no comment.
Okay. Another question came in on bees, so I'll go ahead and ask it now. Can you speak to pheromones in bees and what may attract them to certain plants, certain people? Oh, okay. Perfumes or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know 100% true. I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff here, but yeah, if you think about perfumes, I mean, what are perfumes? You're trying to mimic and smell like a flower, right? For the most part. So, I mean, it's certainly possible that bees, if you go outside and you're heavily scented and, whatever, you could have some bees, flying around you because they think you're a wonderful flower or something. That definitely could happen. I haven't heard so much about pheromones. So I don't know if there's any research out there that says anything like that. That's kind of interesting. I mean, sweat bees are called that because they will come and land on your skin and drink your sweat. I mean, that happens to me a lot in the field. I'll just feel a little tickle, it'll just be a little sweat bee hanging out. It's really cool.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess we'll move on from bees to other insects. Does the systemic chemical for controlling woolly worm, or woolly adelgids, I should say, on hemlock harm cicadas? Let's see, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but well, these chemicals that we use, are they going to attract or harm other insects?
Yeah, it is really tricky because, I'm not familiar exactly with the pesticide that's used for woolly adelgids. But, same thing with emerald ash borers too, right? Where the recommendation is, if you want to save individual specimen trees from these invasive insects, you do these systemic pesticides, and they are pesticides, right? So they're designed to kill other insects. And sometimes what you might see is perhaps they don't kill an insect outright, but it could be, something where it affects different, like their, nervous system or immune system, digestive system. Those are kind of some of the issues we see with neonicotinoids, where they don't kill them outright, but they really make them sick. So that's possible.
Okay, can you provide a good way to, what's a good way to provide a water source for pollinators?
So bees really don't need a whole lot of water. I mean, they get a lot of their liquids from, nectar, things like that. So they're not, like bees, and I'm always a little hesitant to say, I mean, you can put out, very shallow bowls, sometimes with like little rocks and stuff to create a very shallow kind of water depression, but you got to watch out for mosquitoes. If you have a bird bath or something, that's usually totally acceptable, but it's not something that you really, I think, need to focus too much on. You do have species like mason bees that will collect dirt, and then, maybe they need the water to do certain things with their nest building. And I can see that being part of it, but I wouldn't go out of your way if you don't have something that's already on your property.
Yeah, okay. Can you talk a little bit about outdoor lighting? How bad is it for the pollinators?
That's an interesting one. So, the old answer would be like, oh, well, pollinators are in the day, so, who cares about that? But actually, we're starting to see a lot more research happening with, moths at night are actually pollinators. So there are some associations with night flying insects and night blooming flowers. And it's really interesting. It's a very understudied field. So I would imagine that the same rules apply to, like, with fireflies, which are another species group that's near and dear to my heart, where you want to just try and minimize, I think, your lights in general outside at night if you can help it. Certainly near areas where there's a lot of vegetation or flowers or something of that nature, just to kind of help with that.
Okay, we're going to move on to plants now, near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
So this is plants and insects then. If a flower's been pollinated by an animal, how often is the pollen available? Like, when is the flower able to pollinate again? I mean, how soon can another bee come to a plant, a flower that's been already, sucked on by a bee?
That's a really good question, because nectar is the same way too, where both pollen and nectar, once again, I hate saying it like this, it depends on the species, but that is the answer though, because you have some species, and I know I'm a little bit more familiar with like nectar recharge, where you can have, nectar offered during, in the morning, and then by the late afternoon, it's recharged. Or some plants, it only offers nectar one time during the day. And, I talked a little bit about temporal stuff with pollinators, more over like the months or seasons, but within the span of a day, there's temporal things that happen where, you have your squash flowers, that come out, and there's squash bees that are native bees, and they will come at dawn and pollinate those squash flowers, and, the pollen in the flower will shut and it'll be closed before even the honeybees or bumblebees get up. So there's different strategies within the day that occur for a lot of these flowers, and some flowers probably will have, and also depends on the amount of pollen that's available. So maybe they offer a lot, and then they're, open for business for a while, and maybe they only want a little bit, and it depends on the time of day, and there's all these different things. But it's a really interesting subject that there's just a lot of different answers to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess somebody's asking about shade-loving native plants that are good for pollinators.
Mm-hmm. What about you? You probably have some ideas about that, don't you?
Well, I mean, there are shade-loving goldenrods, there are shade-loving asters, there, some of those genuses have, grow in the shade. So
yes. Yeah. No, that's true. And I think there are a lot
wild
of
ginger.
Yes. Yeah. Wild ginger is a cool one. I think that one's pollinated by flies or ants. I can't remember which one it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there's a lot of the woodland ephemeral flowers that occur in the spring. Those are really great, like your spring beauties, your cutleaf toothwort. And, there's a lot of really interesting ones that grow on the ground layer, but then, a lot of your shrubs and trees can be a little bit more shade loving as well. And yeah, certainly, like you said, there's a variety of different goldenrods and asters. And I hesitate to get too specific because, I know this is statewide. So my knowledge is more Piedmont based, but there are a lot out there. And pollinators certainly use them. So
be sure and look at your regional plant guides. And most of them indicate whether, the plants are good for pollinators. Mm-hmm. So yeah, check those out. couple of very specific questions. Is there a bee balm or Monarda that doesn't spread so much?
I wish. If you find it, let me know.
Well, I find that Monarda didyma, the red bee balm, doesn't spread as much, especially if you have Monarda fistulosa with it, because the pinky purple one will, just overrun the didyma. So, just it all depends on the habitat, how moist your soil is, how much sun.
No, that's true. And I know, there's a Monarda punctata, which I think was in one of the photos I showed at Bruce Jones's place. That one is really interesting. And, I don't see it to be as, widespread of a grower. I mean, Monarda fistulosa.
I don't find that one to be a very good perennial. It's kind of a short-lived perennial,
Yes.
but a really cool plant.
Agreed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Somebody's asking about cultivars, like a Merlot redbud labeled as a native plant when she bought it. Does it actually offer good habitat? So there you can go into the cultivar issue again.
It's tricky. And it's one thing to, if you've already purchased one kind of just unwittingly, just not aware of it. I've done that a couple of times in the past, and it's tough. I mean, the rule of thumb really is, you just don't want whatever the cultivar is to really alter the plant in its natural form, like so much that it is like unfamiliar to pollinators or other wildlife. And, the other issue too is sometimes cultivars are sterile or they don't offer pollen or nectar, and that's another problem because you're putting something out into the landscape that's not really going to be beneficial for pollinators. So, there's a whole host of issues and it's just really tricky. I mean, there are, I'm thinking of, since we were just talking about Monarda didyma, we're talking about Jacob Klein, and there are cultivars that are based on sort of these like wild genetic variations that naturally existed in nature and were already there and were kind of different from the straight species and were taken and put into the nursery tray. And it's like, well, if that one was, naturally existing in nature, then, it's not as big of a thing. But, those are probably the exception in my book. But it's tough. Like if your Merlot redbud isn't too different, or, you can tell too, like if they're not flowers and butterflies and bees are not visiting often or at all, then you can kind of tell something's probably up. So,
if the leaf color is different or something, you change the structure of the flower, then that's really going to be seen differently by the insects. The Virginia Native Plant Society recently adopted a statement on cultivars, and I urge some of you to read that at our website, vnps.org. It's under conservation, and it's also under, planting natives. But, if you have the opportunity to buy the wild type native, do it. We just know that, especially if you're anywhere near natural areas. If you're in a city garden, it's just not as bad. I mean, not as critical to try and stay away from all cultivars, but given the choice, go for the straight species or native species, wild type species. Somebody says that native plants are not so common in Northern Virginia nurseries and are not inexpensive. Where do you find the plants that you recommend?
Yes.
I could also help answer this too.
Do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, I could start off by saying, go to the VNPS website, vnps.org again, and we have a website about native plant nurseries. These are nurseries that specialize in native plants. And we also have native plant sales that a lot of our chapters host. So look for those. Even the Potomac chapter is having a sale like first Wednesday of every month. Tomorrow is the first Wednesday, and they're having a sale at their native plant beds at Green Spring Gardens Park in the Alexandria area of Fairfax County. So that's tomorrow at 10. So, and then I think Loudon Wildlife Conservancy is offering their native plant sale this Saturday. So these things are on our VNPS website. So you can look under events, you can look under native plant sales, native plant, you know, growing native plants. So we try to cover that there. And also the Plant Virginia Natives, a lot of the local regional sites have information about that. They might have native plant nurseries that they recommend. So, and you can go to our VNPS Facebook group page and join that. And we have like 9,500 people in that now asking these very questions. So you can kind of scroll through that and find it. So a lot of information on where you can get native plants. Anything you want to add, Celia?
I think you did a really great job of summarizing it. You know, I'll just say from my experience, I really enjoy going to the chapter sales. You know, I find that it gets some really great deals, and they're really just great plants and support, obviously, a great cause. And yeah, you know, it is really tricky, you know, if you're looking to do a large landscape project and you need a lot of plugs, you know, landscape plugs, so tiny plants, you know, and you're looking at, you know, buying, you know, your options maybe are a little bit limited, and they're larger plants and they are expensive. I mean, some of that too just kind of comes back to, you just have to keep in mind that the native plant nurseries in Northern Virginia and beyond, I mean, these are, you know, small businesses, you know, they're not Home Depot where they can really, you know, provide a lot of those discounted prices for plants. So, you know, there's a little bit of that to consider as well. You know, and there is a really great nursery, Earth Sangha, which is in Northern Virginia, that does offer wholesale native plants as well for larger landscape projects if you're looking for something like that. But you know, the campaigns, broadly speaking, of course, the native plant campaigns, you know, we're all working to try and, you know, work with some of these larger, kind of more traditional nurseries in our regions to carry straight species and to advertise them and things of that, so to try and help, you know, bolster the availability of plant stock. So yeah.
Some of my other moderators here suggest saving seeds and, you know, meeting up with other native plant people, like joining Native Plant Society and all that. You'll meet other people and you can trade, you know, trade plants, trade seeds, go to your local nurseries and ask them to carry native plants. That demand will increase the supply, we hope. That's the whole idea of the Plant Virginia Native campaign. We want, you know, the nurseries to offer what, you know, what we need out there. Native plants, the growers will only sell them if there's a demand for them. So let them know that there is a demand. Let's see. So I know a lot of them are expensive. Sometimes you can work with your native plant nurseries themselves and see if you can work with them to get a whole tray of plugs from them, that they might order it from a wholesale nursery and provide it to you. And that might be a way that you can do that. So let's see. I want to make sure we get to all kinds of questions here. There are a lot of other areas. Let's see, under pesticides and chemicals, somebody asked, would you discuss glyphosate's impact on pollinators? And glyphosate is typically Roundup, and there are some other brand names on glyphosate.
Yeah, and you know, glyphosate is used as an herbicide. So when it's being applied, it's primarily being applied to kill a plant. And you know, a lot of times when you're using glyphosate or other herbicides, you're spraying it, you know, not always. There's different ways to apply herbicides, but I think the average homeowner most of the time probably is applying it directly to the leaves, and there is a higher incident of it, you know, hitting a insect pollinator that just happens to be there, that kind of thing. So, you know, but they don't work the same way as pesticides, but they are, you know, obviously chemicals that can impact insects if they are there in the landscape. You know, I think the bigger issue is just making sure that, you know, kind of stopping and asking yourself, you know, do you need to apply herbicides in this particular situation? Is there another way to use, you know, to do whatever it is that you need to do? You know, herbicides are in general a really tricky topic, and there are no easy answers, I think, or, you know, it's a really complicated situation. And sometimes, you know, you might need to use it for invasive species control, things of that nature, which you want to do to control the invasives in order to get natives in the picture. So, but in terms of them having direct effects on pollinators, unless it's you're actually directly spray an insect while you're applying it, you know, I don't know of anything that's going to be sublethal or beyond that.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the 8 o'clock hour. Let me go ahead and ask a question. I think that might have been one of the very first ones to come through the Q&A. When is a good time to cut back the debris and add it to the compost? Is now the time?
That's a hard one because it sort of depends on your situation. You know, I'm thinking about what I'm doing at my house, and you know, thinking particularly about, let's just say, like the native bees that are using, you know, dead standing flower stems and reeds, you know, because normally, you know, they're using like Joe Pye weed. If you have that, is, you know, just great, perfect stems, really stiff, you know, and they're usually hollow. So you'll see a lot of ground nesting bees using them. So you really don't want to remove those from your landscape right now, because if a bee nested in it in the fall or something, or the summer, they're still in there. So you have to wait for them to kind of hatch back out. That's not always possible for everybody, because I know, you know, if you're in an HOA or something like that, where, you know, you need to have it a little bit more kept, then it gets a little bit trickier, and you've got to sort of weigh your chances. You know, for me, I never touch the leaf litter in my garden. It drives my husband crazy, but I just like it's not going anywhere, you know. So the only thing I really clean up per se are those dead standing stems, and I leave them up for a while. Or if I do have to cut it, like I'll just cut it so that it's a little shorter and it looks intentional. Because, you know, a lot of that, when it's, you know, benign neglect, I think that's how Janet Davis describes, you know, kind of this gardening for wildlife stuff. You know, if it looks intentional, like you're doing it on purpose, and it's not just like, you know, whatever, maybe your HOA or whoever it is, you know, is a little bit more comfortable with that. But really try and leave things as much as possible till we get a little bit into spring, if you can. You know, it's whatever's realistic.
Can you put those long stalks in, say, like a brush pile or something? Or is that, do they need to be vertical?
Yeah, you really kind of want them up off the ground, and, you know, it's more just so they don't get damaged or too wet or anything like that, because that'll be an issue if they're put in kind of like a dark spot. You know, there's issues with like fungus and mold and stuff that could occur. So yeah, it really kind of depends on how creative you want to be and how long you can leave them up for.
We have some questions about invasive plants. Where can you find help with identifying invasive plants and planning for native plants, and especially in the Richmond area? And that kind of segues into the next program, right, Beth? We're going to have a program presented by Beth by the Blue Ridge PRISM, which is Blue Ridge Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. So just wanted to mention that, because that is a question. Do we want to stay on the line much longer? There are just a few other questions out here.
Well, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, it's only 8:03. We can answer them all.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Pollinator bats. Are there any species of pollinating bats in Virginia?
No, all those cool guys live in the Southwest and in Mexico. Yeah, all the bats we have up this way are insectivorous, so they're, you know, insect eating. The nectar drinking bats are really not in this part of the world, unfortunately. They're really neat.
Okay. There's concern about, I'm not sure what this word is, cornifrons outcompeting native mason bees? Do you know what that is?
I'm gonna guess that that's probably an invasive bee species, which, you know, we have invasive species for every group of animals. So of course we're gonna have, you know, invasive bees as well. And I'm not entirely sure which genus that, or who that bee, what family that bee belongs to. But yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, any non-native bee that's recently introduced, I mean, of course, there's going to be a concern, you know, which is just another thing on the list of, you know, threats to native bees. And, you know, it's not necessarily one threat by itself, but it's all of them that kind of work together in tandem that really creates, you know, a major burden on a lot of populations. So you muted yourself somehow.
I had to mute myself because my partner was starting to make a bunch of noise around me. Sorry. There's a question here. Let's see. I was having trouble toggling back and forth. Does deer repellent sprayed on plants harm or deter bees and beneficial insects?
Oh, interesting. I don't know for sure. Deer repellent, you know, that's interesting. I wonder if it would have any effect on more of like, you know, caterpillars, you know, things like that, because it is designed to make, you know, your plants not taste good, essentially, right? So it's possible that it could deter them, or I mean, the stuff can be really stinky, so it is possible that it could mask flower odor. But you know, it doesn't last forever, you know, unfortunately, you know how it is, you gotta like keep putting it on after however many days or something like that, or after it rains. So I don't know if it would end up having like a really major effect. And if the, you know, compromise is, well, you put it on or you lose that plant entirely, because we know how deer are, then, you know, it's probably, I would say, maybe a calculated risk, as long as you're not like saturating your entire landscape with it. You know, if it's just one or two like really important plants, then see what happens.
Yeah. Okay, this is a question that I didn't even know they exist, but are dwarf oaks good pollinator plants, and where could somebody purchase them?
Dwarf oaks, yes. And I know I've heard this kind of question asked before, because there's that, you know, whole thing where we all would love to be able to plant oaks, as Doug Tallamy always talks about, but, you know, not having the space. I know that this is a very specific example, and I'm sure this isn't the only nursery, but Janet Davis of Hill House Farm and Nursery, who was on, I think, 2 or 3 talks ago, she used to carry some dwarf species of different oaks. Like I want to say she had like a dwarf chinkapin oak. I don't know if she still does, because her, you know, stock changes every year, but it would be worth checking around your native plant nurseries to see if there's any dwarf species. I don't really know much about how they would behave in a landscape, or how small dwarf really is. You know, is it just 20 feet as opposed to 50? You know, I don't really know some of those, but you know, they're
And of course there are cultivars, right? I mean, that's a cultivar if it's dwarf. It's not naturally occurring.
Right, exactly. So it's, you know, you got that whole thing too that you have to weigh. So might not be the best option. There's probably something you could find better suited for your site.
I would think that if you have a very small area, that maybe you should concentrate on your HOA lands or nearby parks or something, to make sure that they provide, you know, they have the oaks there. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, you got to think, you know, kind of what I was saying, like look to what's beyond your property lines. You know, you could have a very lovely oak tree just next door, and, you know, that's just not something you really need to focus on. And what you really need in the larger landscape are just flowers or whatever it may be. So,
yeah. Somebody asked about winterberries. Does anyone know a local native plant seller that sexes their winterberries? This woman wants to get 2, but she'd like to have a male and female so that she could get berries. I say woman, I don't know, this could be a man who posed this question.
Yes, that's totally fair. Yeah. So most native plant nurseries that I've encountered, you know, in the northern part of Virginia where I work, usually are sexed. You know, I'm just thinking of, Hill House Farm and Nursery. There's also Piedmont Nursery in Markham, Watermark Woods in Loudoun County. I mean, it's one of those
By
things.
design, yeah.
Yes, Nature by Design. That was the other one I was like blanking on there. But I mean, in other parts of the state, I mean, I think you could probably just give them a call and check, because you're right. You do need male and female, and they're not the only shrub species that, you need that. So.
Yeah. Let's see. Trying to think if I'm scrolling through these questions that the other moderators have been so kind to put into a document for me, so I can kind of scroll through there, and they've even categorized them into, bees and other insects and whatnot. We never came up with a recommendation for an actual cavity nesting bee house, correct?
Like one you can just buy.
Yeah, or one that you can make, I guess, specifically. He said, collection of tubes. And
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's really, I have yet to see like a design that I really 100% like. And, there's just a lot of things that I think go into it, and you're better off reading through materials that like the Xerces Society puts out and sort of constructing your own. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Is there any information about nectar and pollen of non-native plants that might have a negative impact on native bees?
No. So the tricky thing about invasive plants is that bees and other pollinators don't necessarily not go to them because they're not native. Like, I'm just thinking, for one example, the like bumblebees, when I was doing my research, bumblebee queens really love autumn olive flowers in general. Like, I hate to say it, really like a great pollinator plant. Like, I hate saying it like that, but I'm just talking about the insects that are actually pollinating and nectaring on them. Obviously caterpillars cannot eat, or they won't eat, the non-native species. But yeah, I haven't seen anything that's like it actually hurts them in any way. They either won't use it or they will. It's one of the two.
And just benign, non-native plants, we don't know of any negative impacts, I guess.
No, not that I've heard of.
Yeah, I mean, some of our benign non-native plants offer no pollen or nectar or something.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's more of an issue, is that they're just like sterile